By 1 a.m. on April 30th, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel reported that all of Hitler's forces meant to support Berlin were either surrounded or on the defensive. Around 2:30 a.m., Hitler appeared in the hallway where about 20 people, mostly women, had gathered to say their farewells. He shook hands and spoke with each person before returning to his room. Later that morning, with Soviet forces less than 500 meters from the Führer bunker, Hitler met with General Helmuth Weidling, the commander of Berlin's defense area. Weidling informed Hitler that the garrison would likely run out of ammunition that night, signaling the end of the fighting in Berlin within 24 hours. He requested permission for a breakout, which he had asked for previously without success. Hitler did not immediately respond, so Weidling returned to his headquarters. At around 1 p.m., Weidling received permission from Hitler to attempt a breakout that night. Following this, Hitler had lunch with 2 secretaries and his personal cook, then bid farewell to bunker staff, including Bormann, Goebbels, secretaries, and several military officers. At approximately 2:30 p.m., Adolf and Eva Hitler entered his personal study, with Hitler's adjutant Otto Günsche standing guard outside. After some time, Hitler's valet Heinz Linge entered the antechamber and noticed the door closed, sensing a strong odor. He returned to the corridor and entered the study with Bormann. Linge later noted an unusual smell, typical of chemical agents. Inside, he discovered Hitler and Braun no longer alive on the sofa, with Hitler leaning to his right. Günsche soon followed and described Braun's body as slumped next to Hitler, who had been wounded. Blood had stained the sofa and rug. Ling observed no visible marks on Braun. Her passing was attributed to poisoning. Both Günsche and SS Brigadeführer Wilhelm Mohnke confirmed that no outsiders had accessed Hitler's quarters during his passing, which occurred between 3 p.m. and 4 p.m. Günsche informed those in the briefing room, including Goebbels and Generals Hans Krebs and Wilhelm Burgdorf. They, along with others like Hitler Youth leader Arthur Axmann, viewed the scene. Linge and another man wrapped Hitler's body in a rug. Following Hitler's earlier instructions, they carried the bodies to the garden behind the Reich Chancellery to be burned with fuel. Although partially covered, witnesses recognized Hitler's remains due to identifiable features. Bunker telephone operator Ruckus Misch reported the situation to Führerbegleitkommando Chief Franz Schädler and returned to the switchboard, later hearing someone shout that the bodies were being burned. Initial attempts to ignite the fuel failed, prompting Linge to fetch a roll of papers. Bormann lit the papers and threw them onto the bodies. As they caught fire, a group, including Bormann and Günsche, saluted from the bunker doorway. Around 4:15 p.m., Linge instructed SS Untersturmführer Heinz Krüger and SS Oberscharführer Werner Schwedel to roll up the rug in Hitler's study for burning. Schwedel later remarked on the pool of blood beside the sofa and picked up a spent cartridge case. The men removed the rug and took it outside to be burned. Throughout the afternoon, the Red Army shelled the area around the Reich Chancellery. SS guards brought more fuel to ensure the bodies burned thoroughly. Despite being burned in the open, eyewitnesses noted that the large amount of fuel used reduced the remains to charred bones and ashes. By 6:30 p.m., Lindloff and possibly Reiser covered the remains in a shallow bomb crater. Shelling and fires continued until May 2nd, making the garden nearly uninhabitable. Aftermath. Krebs met Soviet General Vasily Chuikov just before 4 a.m. on May 1st, informing him of Hitler's death while trying to arrange a ceasefire and start peace talks. Joseph Stalin learned of Hitler's passing around 4:05 a.m. Berlin time, 13 hours later. He demanded an unconditional surrender, which Krebs was not authorized to grant. Stalin sought confirmation of Hitler's death and ordered the Red Army's counter-espionage unit, SMERSH, to locate his remains. The first indication to the world that Hitler was no longer alive came from the Germans themselves. On the night of May 1st, the Reichssender Hamburg radio station interrupted its usual programming to announce that Hitler had passed away that afternoon and introduced his successor, Dönitz. Dönitz urged the German people to mourn their leader, whom he described as a figure defending the capital. In an effort to protect the army and nation, Donitz permitted a strategic withdrawal to the west. This tactic allowed about 1.8 million German soldiers to evade capture by Soviet forces, though it resulted in significant casualties, with fighting continuing until May 8. On the early morning of May 2nd, the Soviets took control of the Reich Chancellery. In the Führerbunker, Krebs and Bergdorf ended their lives. By early May, the dental remains of Hitler and Braun were recovered from the ground. Stalin was skeptical about Hitler's fate and limited public information. By May 11th, dental assistant Käthe Häusermann and technician Fritz Echtmann, who had worked for Hitler's dentist, confirmed the identification of Hitler's and Braun's dental remains. Both individuals spent years in Soviet prisons. An alleged Soviet autopsy of Hitler released in 1968 was referenced by forensic odontologist R.F. Sogness and Ferdinand Strum to affirm the authenticity of Hitler's dental remains in 1972. In 2017, French forensic pathologist Philippe Charlier also inspected the dental remains stored in Soviet archives and found them consistent with X-rays taken of Hitler in 1944. Charlier analyzed tartar using electron microscopy, revealing only plant fibers, aligning with Hitler's vegetarian diet. A paper published in May 2018 concluded these remains cannot be a fake, noting their wear. No gunpowder residue was found, countering claims that Hitler died from a gunshot wound to the mouth. In early June 1945, Smersh relocated the remains of various individuals, including the Goebbels family, from Buch to Finow. It was rumored that Hitler and Braun's remains were moved too, but this is likely Soviet disinformation. There is no evidence of any bodily remains of Hitler or Braun being discovered by the Soviets, except for the dental remains. The Goebbels family's remains were buried in a Brandenburg forest on June 3, 1945, later exhumed and transferred to a new Smersh facility in Magdeburg, where they were reburied in February 1946. By 1970, the facility was controlled by the KGB, which planned to return it to East Germany. To prevent the burial site from becoming a focal point for extremist groups, KGB Director Yuri Andropov approved an operation to cremate the remains. On April 4, 1970, a KGB team thoroughly cremated the remains and scattered the ashes in the Biederitz River, a tributary of the Elbe. For political reasons, the Soviet Union circulated different versions of Hitler's fate. On June 5th, they claimed that his body had been examined and he died from poisoning. At a press conference on June 9th, they stated they had not identified the body and suggested Hitler might have escaped. When asked in July 1945 how Hitler had died, Stalin speculated he was living in Spain or Argentina. In November 1945, Dick White, head of counterintelligence in Berlin's British sector, tasked agent Hugh Trevor Roper with investigating. His report was expanded and published in 1947 as The Last Days of Hitler. In the years following the war, the Soviets continued to assert that Hitler was alive, possibly sheltered by former Western allies or hiding in Spain or South America. The 1947 American book, Who Killed Hitler?, suggested that Soviet leaders kept the myth of Hitler alive to motivate their people against fascism. Until the mid-1950s, the US FBI and CIA received numerous leads suggesting Hitler might still be alive, but they dismissed them all. Documents remained classified until the early 2010s due to the 1998 Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. The secrecy surrounding the investigation fueled speculation about Hitler's survival. Judge Michael Musmano, overseeing the Einsatzgruppen trial in Nuremberg, deemed such claims contrary to the evidence. Between 1948 and 1952, during denazification efforts in West Germany, legal disputes over Hitler's property were complicated by the absence of an official death declaration. Starting in 1952, a federal court in Berchtesgaden interviewed 42 witnesses regarding Hitler's death conducted privately to avoid influencing testimonies. After 4 years of thorough examination, Judge Heinrich Stephanus concluded, "There can no longer be the slightest doubt that on April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler ended his own life in the Chancellery with a gunshot to his right temple." A death certificate was issued on February 25, 1956, along with a report exceeding 500 pages. An 80-page expert criminological report created in mid-1956 highlighted significant inconsistencies in eyewitness accounts and served as a basis for photographic reconstructions. Ballistic tests were conducted to ascertain the most likely scenario for the fatal shot. The declaration became publicly accessible and legally binding by the end of that year. Hitler's death was registered as an assumption based on the fact that none of the witnesses had seen his body, which historian Anton Joachimsthaler argues is incorrect. The federal court subsequently released a summary of its findings in a 1958 press release. Further Soviet inquiries and misinformation. On December 11, 1945, the Soviets permitted a restricted investigation of the bunker area by the Allied nations, which included Britain, France, and the US. 2 representatives from each country observed several Germans excavating soil down to the concrete bunker roof, including the bomb crater where Hitler's remains had been interred. During the excavation, 2 hats belonging to Hitler, an undergarment with bronze initials, and some documents addressed to Hitler from Goebbels were discovered. The Soviet NKVD halted further digging, accusing the representatives of taking documents from the Reich Chancellery. By the end of 1945, Stalin instructed the NKVD to create a second commission to look into Hitler's fate. On May 30, 1946, agents from the MVD, the NKVD's successor, found a piece of skull in the crater where Hitler's remains had been dug up. This fragment included parts of the occipital and parietal bones. Notably, the left parietal bone displayed a bullet hole, likely an exit wound. This evidence was not catalogued until 1975 and was rediscovered in the Russian State Archives in 1993. In 2009, Nick Bellantoni, an archaeologist and bone expert from the University of Connecticut, analyzed the skull fragment, which Soviet officials believed belonged to Hitler. Bellantoni commented that the bone appeared very thin for a male and suggested the sutures indicated it belonged to someone under 40. A small piece detached from the skull underwent DNA testing, along with blood from Hitler's sofa. The skull was identified as female, while the blood was confirmed to be male. On December 29, 1949, a secret file on Hitler was presented to Stalin, compiled from interrogations of Nazis who were in the Führer bunker, including Gunsche and Linge. Western historians gained access to the Soviet Union's archives starting in 1991, but this dossier remained hidden for 12 years. It was published in 2005 as the Hitler Book. In 1968, Soviet journalist Lev Bezymensky released his book, The Death of Adolf Hitler, featuring previously unpublished photographs of dental remains. The book details a supposed Soviet forensic examination led by Faust Shkarovsky, concluding that Hitler passed due to cyanide. Bezymensky speculated that Hitler requested an alternative means for a swift end, but later acknowledged including inaccuracies, particularly regarding the exact events. The book and its purported autopsy have faced significant criticism from Western historians. Joachimsthaler, in his detailed review of Hitler's final moments, quoted a German pathologist who dismissed the autopsy report. Bezymensky's report is inconsistent. It describes anything but what truly happened. Journalist James P. O'Donnell suggested Hitler could have used poison and still had time for another method. Legacy. After Hitler's passing and the conclusion of World War II in Europe, Germany was split into 4 sections. This division sparked the Cold War between the Western Bloc, backed by the United States, and the Eastern Bloc, supported by the Soviet Union. From 1961 to 1989, this separation was visibly represented by the Berlin Wall, which was followed by Germany's reunification in 1990 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. In his diary, war veteran and future U.S. President John F. Kennedy noted that Hitler had an enigmatic quality both in life and death that would linger on. Historian Joachim Fest suggests that the almost invisible nature of Hitler's end kept his persona alive in public discourse, giving him a strange sort of afterlife. Theories stemming from Soviet misinformation that claimed he survived fueled ongoing skepticism and speculation, leading to sensational tabloid articles and journalistic pieces well into the late 20th century. Interest in theories surrounding Hitler's fate and the Nazi era persists, with with new books, TV shows, and films continually emerging on the subject. Historian Luke Daly-Groves argued that Hitler's fate symbolizes more than just the end of one individual. It represents the conclusion of a regime and the ideological legacy it left behind.